June 1944. Normandy, France. The hedgerows are still wet from night rain. Earth clings to boots. The air smells of crushed leaves, cordite, and sweat. Somewhere beyond the tangled green walls, men are breathing quietly, waiting for a sound that does not belong. A German infantryman crouches low in a shallow slit trench carved into chalky soil. His rifle rests beside him, unused. In his hands is something smaller, shorter, dark with dried mud. A folding shovel, its edge worn thin by hours of digging and sharpening against stone. He listens. Footsteps. Close. Too close for a shot without giving himself away. This moment is not written into grand strategy maps or operational briefings. It never appears in victory parades. But it is here, between hedgerows in the dark at arm's length, that infantry doctrine reveals its true shape. Across the Atlantic, American soldiers carry similar tools now. Issued, standardized, copied from German design. Steel folded neatly against canvas packs. But the purpose is not the same. Because for the German army, this shovel was never just for earth. It was for survival. And when needed, it was for killing. And that difference would matter more than anyone realized. Europe did not enter the Second World War unprepared. It entered scarred. When the guns fell silent in November 1918, the continent was already marked by a lesson written in mud and blood. The First World War had taught every major power the same truth. Modern war was not decided by cavalry charges or individual heroics, but by men who could endure exposure, entrenchment, and sudden violence at terrifying proximity. Nowhere was that lesson absorbed more deeply than in Germany. The Imperial German Army had survived 4 years inside trenches that became graves. Officers who lived through it carried those memories forward into the interwar years. They remembered what artillery did to men without cover. They remembered how rifles failed in rain, how bayonets were clumsy in tight spaces, and how survival often depended on what a soldier could do when the weapon in his hands was no longer usable. After 1919, Germany was stripped of much of its army by treaty. But doctrine survived even when divisions did not. Training manuals, field regulations, and professional military education quietly preserved the experience of close combat. The Reichswehr and later the Wehrmacht would be small on paper, but dense with institutional memory. By the early 1930s, German infantry doctrine was being rebuilt around a single, ruthless principle. The battlefield belongs to the soldier who adapts fastest at the lowest level. This was not philosophy. It was necessity. German planners understood that their future wars would be fast, violent, and fluid. Infantry would advance behind armor, but often without it. Soldiers would move through forests, villages, fields, and rubble. They would fight at night. They would dig constantly, sometimes under fire, sometimes after exhausting marches, sometimes knowing the hole might be the only thing standing between life and instant death. Entrenchment was not defensive thinking. It was offensive survival. Every German infantryman was trained to dig. Not later. Not when ordered. Immediately. Shallow slit trenches. Foxholes shaped to deflect blast. Positions angled to reduce shrapnel. soil thrown forward, never behind. The act of digging was instinctive, drilled until it became automatic. And the tool that enabled this was not an afterthought. The klapspaden, the folding entrenching tool, was compact, strong, and brutally simple. Its steel head could lock into place. Its short handle allowed use in confined spaces. It was easy to sharpen, easy to carry, easy to swing. German manuals did not romanticize it. They did not need to. Training culture handled that. Recruits learned quickly that the shovel was the first thing they reached for under fire. And sometimes when the distance collapsed to meters, it was the only thing that fit the moment. Close combat was not an accident in German doctrine. It was expected. Stormtrooper tactics from the late stages of the First World War were studied closely. Small units, infiltration, sudden violence, grenades, knives, blunt force. Speed mattered more than elegance. Silence mattered more than marksmanship. In these conditions, a long rifle was not always an advantage. Bayonets snagged on walls. Stocks cracked. Magazines ran dry. But a sharpened shovel did not jam. By the time Germany went to war in September 1939, the infantryman's relationship with his entrenching tool was already defined. It was not symbolic. It was practical. It was intimate. Dig first. Survive the shelling. Then be ready for whatever comes over the edge. This mindset followed German soldiers into Poland, France, the Balkans, and eventually into the vast, frozen spaces of the East. Everywhere the front stabilized, even briefly, steel met earth, and sometimes steel met flesh. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, another army was watching the war unfold, studying equipment lists, evaluating foreign designs, preparing to modernize. They saw the shovel. What they did not yet see was the thinking behind it. And that gap between object and intent would quietly widen as the war expanded. In the years before the United States entered the war, its army lived in a different world. The U.S. Army of the late 1930s was small, geographically isolated, and shaped by assumptions that no longer applied in Europe. Its doctrine emphasized firepower, mobility, and industrial efficiency. Infantry was important, but it was not yet imagined as something that would be forced into sustained, intimate combat against a hardened continental enemy. American military planning assumed distance. The Atlantic and Pacific Oceans were strategic buffers. Wars, if they came, would be fought far from home. Logistics, not improvisation, dominated thinking. The United States believed it could outproduce any enemy, and history would prove that belief correct. But production did not automatically translate into battlefield culture. Before 1941, American infantry training stressed marksmanship, unit cohesion, and command control. Close combat existed in manuals, but it did not dominate them. Digging was necessary, but it was treated as a task, not as a reflex. Field fortifications were orderly, planned, executed when time allowed. American entrenching tools reflected this mindset. The standard U.S. tool before the war was the T-handle shovel, long, awkward, and designed primarily for labor rather than combat conditions. It worked well in camps, It was inefficient under fire. It was heavy, difficult to carry, and poorly suited for quick, shallow defensive positions. When American observers studied the early campaigns of the war, especially the rapid German advances in Poland and France, they began to notice patterns. German infantry moved fast. They dug quickly. They survived artillery barrages that destroyed slower units. Reports noted how quickly German soldiers disappeared into the ground when shells began to fall. The tool enabling that behavior drew attention. By 1941, U.S. ordnance officers were evaluating foreign equipment in earnest. German and British designs were examined not for ideology, but for function. The German folding shovel stood out immediately. Compact, efficient, easier to carry on long marches, less likely to snag, more practical in confined terrain. The conclusion seemed obvious. Adopt the design. And so the United States did. American engineers developed their own folding entrenching tool, functionally similar, mass-producible, and suited to U.S. manufacturing standards. By the time American troops landed in North Africa in late 1942, the folding shovel was becoming standard issue. On paper, the problem was solved, but doctrine does not travel as easily as steel. American training still framed the entrenching tool as a support implement. Digging was something done after contact, not during it. Close combat remained secondary to firepower. The rifle, the machine gun, and artillery coordination were the decisive elements. In practice, American infantry was superbly equipped for ranged engagements. The M1 Garand delivered firepower unmatched by most of its contemporaries. Squad-level automatic weapons were plentiful. Artillery support was responsive and devastating. But when combat collapsed into hedgerows, forests, ruins, and night patrols, the nature of war shifted. German soldiers had grown up militarily, expecting that shift. They had been trained to fight when formations dissolved, to act independently, to use whatever tool fit the moment. The shovel was not issued as a weapon. It became one because doctrine allowed it to. American soldiers, by contrast, were not encouraged to think of their entrenching tool beyond its intended role. Manuals did not discuss it as a close combat implement. Training did not emphasize its use in extremis. When contact became personal, Americans relied on rifles, pistols, bayonets, and grenades. The difference was subtle, but it mattered. It meant that when German and American units collided at night, in broken terrain or inside half-dug positions, they were not just carrying different equipment. They were carrying different expectations of violence. The United States had copied the object. Germany had built a culture around it. And that distinction would become impossible to ignore once the fighting tightened, the distances closed, and survival depended on what a soldier could do when doctrine stopped helping. That realization begins to surface when we examine the war from multiple angles: human, tactical, and moral, each revealing a different facet of why a shovel could become a weapon. Close combat strips war of abstraction. For the infantryman, fear does not arrive as a concept. It arrives as sound, breathing in the dark, boots on wet soil, metal brushing fabric. In these moments, training is not recalled. It is revealed. German soldiers were conditioned early to expect this closeness. Recruits were taught that battle would not always allow distance, that rifles could be lost, jammed, or simply be too slow. Survival depended on decisiveness when hesitation meant death. The shovel fit naturally into that mental space. It was always in reach, always familiar, always heavy enough to matter. German veterans wrote that it felt solid in the hand, reassuring when everything else felt uncertain. Not because it was designed to kill, but because it was designed to endure. American soldiers experienced the same fear, but from a different starting point. Their confidence rested in firepower and support. When those systems failed, the shock was sharper. The closeness felt unnatural. Improvised violence felt like a breakdown, not an extension of training. This was not weakness. It was difference. One army prepared its men for chaos as normal. The other treated chaos as an exception. Terrain decides how men fight. In open fields, rifles dominate. In forests, ruins, and hedgerows, distance collapses. Germany's campaigns repeatedly forced infantry into these compressed environments. Poland's villages, France's urban pockets, the forests of the Ardennes, the endless tree lines of the Eastern Front. German infantry doctrine assumed that combat would fragment. Squads would split, leaders would fall, orders would stop arriving. In that vacuum, initiative mattered more than compliance. The shovel mattered because it worked everywhere. It dug firing positions quickly. It widened foxholes silently. It cut routes. And when a trench was breached, it could be swung without space or warning. German manuals did not need to instruct this explicitly. The environment taught it. American tactics emphasized maintaining formation integrity and restoring order quickly. When fighting became confused, units worked to reestablish command and bring firepower back to bear. This was effective, but it took time. In that gap, German soldiers acted. The shovel was not superior technology. It was superior timing. Steel tells its own story. The German folding shovel was short-handled, well-balanced, and built to survive abuse. Its edge could be sharpened easily. Its locking mechanism was simple. It did not rattle. It did not break easily. American versions were well-made, but subtly different. Slightly longer handles. Different balance. Manufactured for mass issue rather than individual adaptation. They were tools first. German soldiers modified theirs constantly. Filed edges. Adjusted grips. Treated them as personal equipment. Something trusted. The difference was not in metallurgy. It was in ownership. A weapon is not defined by design alone. It is defined by belief. And belief is shaped by leadership, which brings us to the next set of angles, where training, command culture, and moral boundaries collide. Leadership defines what soldiers believe is permitted. In the German army, junior leadership was not just encouraged, it was expected. The concept of Auftragstactik, mission-type orders, placed responsibility at the lowest possible level. Officers gave intent. NCOs and soldiers executed as circumstances allowed. This philosophy extended beyond maneuvers and into survival. German training emphasized realism over comfort. Recruits were pushed into exhaustion, into confusion, into scenarios where equipment failed and decisions had to be immediate. The implicit message was clear: you will not always have ideal tools. You will use what remains. No German officer needed to instruct a soldier to swing a shovel in close combat. The culture had already authorized improvisation. American leadership culture was different by design. It valued standardization, safety, and repeatability. Training sought to reduce unpredictability, not embrace it. Initiative existed, but within clearer boundaries. This produced disciplined units capable of coordinated firepower. It did not encourage redefining tools in the moment. Neither approach was morally superior, but they produced different instincts. American soldiers noticed. After North Africa, Sicily, and Italy, reports began to circulate quietly among U.S. units. German infantry were described as aggressive at close range. Night patrols encountered unexpected violence. Trenches were breached suddenly. Silence was often followed by shock. Veterans recalled moments where Germans appeared from holes Americans had not noticed. Positions dug fast and shallow, camouflaged with instinctive efficiency. The shovel was rarely mentioned explicitly in official reports, but it appeared in personal accounts, in memoirs, in whispered warnings passed between units. The enemy was not just well-armed. He was comfortable with closeness. That realization changed behavior. American patrols became more cautious. Grenades were used more aggressively. Positions were cleared more thoroughly. But the cultural gap never fully closed. Angle 6, the moral boundary. There is an uncomfortable truth here. War does not ask permission when it compresses distance. It does not pause to respect categories like tool or weapon. It only reveals what men are prepared to do to survive. The German army did not issue shovels as weapons, but did not forbid their use when circumstances collapsed. That silence was not accidental. The United States, shaped by legalism and post-war accountability concerns even during the war itself, maintained clearer conceptual boundaries. A shovel was a tool. A weapon was a weapon. In extreme moments, those boundaries can cost seconds. Sometimes, seconds are everything. This is not a story about brutality alone. It is a story about expectation. And expectations are tested hardest, not in theory, but in the precise moments when battle reaches its breaking point. Those moments arrive next. By 1943 and 1944, the war had narrowed the distance between men. On the Eastern Front, entire divisions fought inside forests so dense that artillery bursts detonated in branches instead of soil. In the West, Allied troops pushed into bocage country where every field was a fortress. In Italy, mountains forced infantry into vertical, claustrophobic fights where visibility collapsed to a few meters. The shovel followed them everywhere. On the Eastern Front, German infantry learned early that trenches were temporary. Artillery erased them. Tanks crushed them. What mattered was how fast a soldier could disappear into the ground again. Sometimes in minutes, sometimes in seconds. Foxholes were shallow, narrow, dug under fire. When Soviet assaults reached German positions, they often did so after hours of bombardment that shattered command and scattered weapons. Accounts from both sides describe fighting that dissolved into hand-to-hand violence inside trenches and shell holes. Rifles were too long. bayonets caught on earth walls. Pistols emptied quickly. The shovel did not fail. German soldiers used it to strike upward from foxholes, to hook legs, to smash helmets. This was not ritualized combat. It was panic, speed, and muscle memory. Survivors described it as sudden and brutal, over before conscious thought caught up. These encounters rarely made it into official histories. They did not scale. They could not be mapped, but they shaped behavior. By the time German units faced the Western Allies in force, they brought this experience with them. In Normandy, after June 6, 1944, American, British, and Canadian troops entered terrain that destroyed distance. The hedgerows forced infantry to advance field by field, each bounded by earthen walls that masked defenders until the last moment. German soldiers dug into these embankments instinctively. American units advancing through the hedgerows often encountered silence, followed by sudden violence at point-blank range. Grenades detonated from unseen angles. Machine gun fire erupted from positions that seemed to appear from nowhere. And when trenches were overrun, the fighting did not stop. Veterans recalled moments where German defenders rose from holes, striking upward before being shot or overwhelmed. These were not counterattacks in the doctrinal sense. They were reflexes, trained responses to proximity. The Hurtgen Forest later that year intensified this pattern. Inside the dense woods near the German border, visibility dropped to meters. Artillery burst shredded trees into lethal splinters. Radios failed. Units lost contact. Combat became personal and relentless. American soldiers dug in constantly, but their digging was reactive. German soldiers dug as anticipation. When patrols collided at night, confusion dominated. Men fired at sound. Then silence returned. Then movement again. In these moments, the shovel appeared not as a symbol, but as a solution. This was not a matter of cruelty versus restraint. American units fought fiercely and adapted quickly. But adaptation takes time. German soldiers had already lived in this space for years. The decisive shift was not technological. It was psychological. The war had trained German infantry to expect collapse, of formation, of distance, of order. When that collapse came, they did not freeze. They acted. American forces would learn these lessons under fire, rapidly and painfully, as the campaign continued and encounters accumulated. That learning process, documented in after-action reports, veteran testimony, and changing tactics, marks the true turning point of this story. Because by late 1944, the Americans were no longer just copying German equipment. They were beginning to understand the cost of copying without context. By late 1944, American infantry units were no longer naive. Months of fighting had stripped away assumptions. Combat experience had done what manuals could not, forcing soldiers and junior leaders to confront the reality of proximity. Reports from Normandy, the Hurtgen Forest, and the approaches to the German border began to show subtle shifts in language. Words like sudden, unexpected, and violent appeared with increasing frequency. Night patrols became more cautious and more aggressive. American after-action reports described German positions that seemed abandoned, only to erupt at arm's length. Trenches that were shallow but lethal. Foxholes dug so quickly they escaped detection until contact was unavoidable. These encounters were not decisive in themselves, but they accumulated. Each one reshaped instinct. American soldiers adapted in familiar ways. They relied more heavily on grenades. They cleared trenches methodically. They increased the use of suppressive fire before movement. Close combat training was intensified where time allowed. But one thing did not change completely. The entrenching tool remained what it had always been in American doctrine, a tool. There were individual exceptions. Veterans later recalled moments where desperation overrode habit, where a shovel was swung because nothing else was available. These were not institutionalized responses. They were human reactions, and they were rarely discussed openly. German units, meanwhile, were reaching the limits of endurance. By 1944, the German army was no longer the force that had crossed borders in 1939. Casualties had hollowed out veteran formations. Replacements arrived with less training. Equipment shortages mounted. But the underlying infantry culture, formed earlier, reinforced by years of brutal fighting, persisted. Even as strategic collapse loomed, German infantry behavior at close range remained aggressive and adaptive. It was one of the last things to erode. In the Ardennes offensive of December 1944, this reality surfaced again. Dense forests, poor visibility, night movement. American units were surprised not just by the scale of the attack, but by the manner in which German infantry closed distance quickly and without hesitation. But this time, Americans were not unprepared. They held. They adapted faster. Firepower reasserted itself. Once weather cleared and coordination returned, the industrial weight of the United States crushed what remained of German operational capability. Yet even in defeat, the lesson lingered. American commanders recognized that equipment alone could not substitute for doctrine. Reports emphasized the need for better preparation for close combat, night fighting, and improvisation. The shovel itself faded back into its original role, not because it was ineffective, but because American military culture chose different solutions. The turning point of this story is not a single battle or date. It is the moment when the United States realized that copying German tools had been easy, but copying German expectations of combat was far harder. The war would soon end. But the question remained: what happens to lessons learned in extremis once peace returns? The answer emerges in the aftermath. By spring 1945, the war in Europe was collapsing under its own weight. Cities burned. Bridges were gone. Armies that had once swept across continents were now retreating in fractured columns. The human cost was staggering. Millions dead, wounded, or displaced. Equipment, once meticulously designed, littered the landscape. Guns rusting, vehicles abandoned, and tools like the folding shovel lying in mud and debris. The German folding shovel, which had once been a symbol of adaptive infantry culture, became a silent witness to the final months. For American forces, the tool itself was now ubiquitous. Soldiers carried it in packs, used it for trenches, field fortifications, and routine labor. Its design, copied from German originals, worked exactly as intended, but the psychological edge it had given the Germans was gone. American soldiers were now experienced, conditioned by months of combat, and capable of responding effectively to close-range encounters. Official post-war reports highlight this shift. U.S. Army after-action studies noted that the intensity of hand-to-hand fighting had been overestimated in early engagements, largely because inexperienced troops had faced veteran German infantry in restricted terrain. By the time the Allies reached the Rhine, American infantry was proficient at clearing foxholes, hedgerows, and fortified positions, using a combination of weapons and improvised tactics. The shovel, while carried and occasionally used in desperate moments, had become just another tool rather than a weapon of instinctive application. For the Germans, the shovel's effectiveness was part of a larger pattern of institutional collapse. Veteran units had been decimated. Replacement soldiers often lacked the training or cultural conditioning to use the tool as it was intended. Supply shortages meant that even basic equipment could not always reach frontline soldiers. Where once a soldier might instinctively use the shovel in sudden combat, by 1945 many were forced to rely solely on firearms, and increasingly survival depended on retreat or surrender rather than skill or improvisation. This contrast illuminates a broader lesson in military adaptation. A tool, no matter how cleverly designed, only has impact when aligns with doctrine, culture, and experience. The Americans had copied the German shovel flawlessly. They had acquired steel, folding hinges, and compact dimensions. But they had to learn through fire and chaos the cultural and tactical context that gave it lethal versatility. The Germans had relied on that context, and when it collapsed, the tool's value could not compensate for organizational failure. Casualty reports, veteran memoirs, and battlefield archaeology all reinforce this reality. In Normandy and the Hurtgen Forest, the ground itself tells the story. Shallow trenches, hastily dug foxholes, and remnants of entrenching tools, sometimes sharpened, sometimes modified, show a soldier's intimate interaction with both earth and enemy. The shovel, once an instrument of instinctive survival and opportunistic offense, became a relic of methodology overtaken by overwhelming industrial and numerical force. The immediate post-war period reinforced these lessons. American doctrine absorbed practical experience from Europe and the Pacific. Close combat training was updated. Entrenching tools were reevaluated not for their steel alone, but for the way soldiers were trained to use them under stress. The lesson was clear. Imitation without understanding yields incomplete results. By adopting the object without initially adopting the underlying philosophy, the U.S. Army had avoided mistakes only through experience, not instruction. The first part of the aftermath ends with a simple recognition. The folding shovel is more than steel. It is a mirror of military culture, a small but revealing measure of how an army prepares its soldiers for the chaos of proximity. And the story is not over. The full implications, how this shaped doctrine, perception, and post-war military thought, emerge in the second part. After Germany's surrender in May 1945, the war's lessons were dissected in countless reports, studies, and memoirs. Among these, the the folding shovel occupied an unexpected place, not as a technological marvel, but as a case study in doctrine, culture, and human adaptation. American post-war analysis acknowledged the tool's utility, but with a critical caveat. Its lethal potential depended entirely on the mindset of the soldier using it. Manuals published in 1946 to 1947 emphasized that entrenching tools were for digging, clearing obstacles, and survival, not for offensive hand-to-hand combat. The U.S. Army concluded that while the folding shovel was an efficient implement, the Germans had exploited it in ways that Americans had initially underestimated. Copies could be issued, but instinctive lethality could not be transferred by design alone. For German veterans, the folding shovel remained a symbol of resourcefulness forged under extreme conditions. It represented improvisation under fire, the ability to turn any implement into a survival tool, and the capacity to exploit every possible advantage in a fragmented battlefield. Yet, it also highlighted a bitter irony. By 1945, most soldiers wielding the tool were exhausted replacements, poorly equipped, and facing overwhelming Allied firepower. The cultural advantage that once made the shovel formidable had evaporated under attrition and industrial imbalance. In broader military thought, this episode influenced doctrine far beyond individual tools. Post-war armies began emphasizing realistic close combat training, improvisation under fire, and psychological conditioning that extended beyond technical manuals. Equipment design alone was no longer considered sufficient. How soldiers were trained to perceive and use their tools became equally critical. The folding shovel also influenced public and professional perception of warfare. Histories, documentaries, and veteran memoirs highlighted its dual role: mundane implement and unexpected weapon. This duality underscored a recurring theme of World War II: the intersection of technology and human behavior. A soldier's success was determined not by the steel in his pack alone, but by experience, doctrine, and instinct. Finally, the lesson of adaptation became institutionalized. American units entering Korea and Vietnam carried compact entrenching tools, but training stressed improvisation and close-quarters tactics. Planners remembered Normandy and Hurtgen. Tools might be copied, but the mindset behind their use could not. The story of the folding shovel, then, is not merely about steel and canvas. It is a narrative about learning under fire, about the unseen cultural edge that defines combat effectiveness, and about how seemingly small details, shovel shape, training intensity, battlefield expectation, can shape outcomes in ways that numbers and logistics cannot fully capture. By understanding this, we see that the end of the war was more than a cessation of fighting. It was a reckoning with the subtleties of doctrine, experience, and adaptation. And from this reckoning emerged a deeper understanding of what it truly means to prepare soldiers for war. War teaches in extremes. The folding shovel tells a story far larger than its size. Steel, canvas, and hinges are trivial compared to the human instinct, doctrine, and experience that give them meaning. The Germans transformed a simple tool into an extension of their tactical philosophy, a way to survive, to act decisively, and when necessary, to strike in moments that formal weapons could not reach. The Americans copied the tool perfectly, but it took months of combat to internalize the doctrine they had overlooked. This contrast illuminates a fundamental truth. Technology alone does not define outcomes. Tools reflect culture, mindset, and preparation. A weapon is only as lethal as the soldier who wields it, not through manuals, but through instinct refined by training and repeated exposure to chaos. The folding shovel also reminds us of the intimacy of warfare. Battles are not fought in abstract maps or logistical tables. They are fought in close quarters, in mud, darkness, and fear. Success is determined as much by human adaptability as by industrial might. In the end, the lesson transcends armies. It is about preparation, observation, and the subtle understanding that context shapes function. Steel copied without culture is limited. Doctrine without flexibility is brittle. And even the smallest object, a shovel, can reveal the hidden architecture of how men survive, fight, and endure. History measures impact not only in victories and defeats, but in the quiet truths soldiers carry into every moment of contact. In the mud of Normandy, the forests of the Ardennes, and the shattered villages across Europe, a simple folding shovel became more than a tool. It became a mirror of doctrine, of culture, and of the human capacity to adapt under fire. And that mirror remains long after the war ended, reflecting lessons still relevant to soldiers, strategists, and historians alike.